There it is. I don't know why it does that anymore. Welcome in, guys. If you're watching this here in the membership portal, you are watching and you're about to dive into with me Eccentric Strengthening, okay? Hypertrophy 101, and this should be the third video of our 4-part series, and this is going to go into hypertrophy, how to build muscle. Last week went over progressive overload. This week we are going over eccentric strengthening, okay? And we're going to talk about exactly how to do it, what it is, why it's important, why you might choose this over another way, and how you can incorporate it into your routine. And once again, guys, I want you to be aware that you guys are watching this in the membership portal. It's going to be recorded and put inside the membership portal. And those folks who are watching this in the Facebook group, you guys can go in the topic section and find it there. Nonetheless, let's get into it, folks, shall we? All right. So, quick review of what we talked about the past few weeks. Number one, hypertrophy is an increase in growth of muscle cells. Hypertrophy refers to an increase in muscular size achieved through exercise. Now, for females, again, I want you to be aware that it doesn't always mean big and bulky, right? You guys don't necessarily have the amount of hormones that you need, right? Testosterone to get big and bulky. You might look more like this lady here. She's chiseled, she's toned, she looks great, right? So there's 3 types of ways to train that are going to get you that hypertrophy. Number 1 is mechanical tension, aka progressive overload. Number 2, eccentric lowering or eccentric strengthening, right? And then number 3, metabolic stress, metabolic conditioning, and that is going to be gone over next week in our 4th video of our 4-part series. All right. Eccentric strengthening, all right, is basically the active contraction of muscle as it lengthens. That might not make sense to you, but it will here in a moment. So an example of this would be as you're sitting down, right? Imagine yourself backing up to a chair, right? And you're going to go sit down on that chair, right? As you're sitting down, your knee is bending, right? Your knees are bending, which is lengthening. And then just think of the word lengthening as stretching. Stretching is lengthening, lengthening is stretching, okay? So you're bending your knee, which is stretching your quad. Your quads are up here, it's stretching your knee. As you can see in this photo here, she's bent down, her knees are being stretched, right? So imagine you're actively doing that as you're sitting down. Well, the eccentric contraction, the eccentric strengthening of that sitting down is when you are lowering yourself down slowly, all right? So if it was not for your quadriceps, which are stretching and activating at the same time, right, you would probably fall back into the chair and you'd injure yourself, right? So at the same time as your quads are stretching, the quads are contracting during the stretch, and it's one of the main reasons that allow you to lower slowly and safely into the chair. As you can see here, right, there it is. There is the example I just gave. Pretty much when you go down to sit in a chair, your knees are bending, stretching out the quads, and they're being actively worked, right? So how would that pertain to you in a workout, right? There's tons of workouts and exercises that you can do that utilize eccentric strengthening, right? Where you're bending the muscle, but that same muscle that is bending is our prime mover. It's the exercise, it's the muscle that we're trying to activate, right? So here it is. Exercises, here's a couple of examples that I give you here. Some of the most common is the glute and hamstrings, right? You can activate, or the Romanian deadlift, which eccentrically target the glutes and the hamstrings. Now, why is that? I want you to ask yourself and type in the comments down below. Why is it that when we do this exercise, we are eccentrically activating the hamstrings and glutes? Type in the comments down below if you've been watching this, right? Or you can just type, I don't know, and I'll answer that for you. Why exactly is it that we are eccentrically utilizing the hamstrings and glutes? How do we know that, folks, during this exercise here? Anybody? I'll give you guys a couple seconds to comment on that. All right. So I'm not seeing anyone here commenting. All right. So the reason why, guys, the reason why we know that we're utilizing the hamstrings and the glutes eccentrically is because they're being stretched. As you can see, I missed the beginning, so I don't know. Heather, welcome in, Heather. So essentially, I'll go back as Heather just popped in. any muscle that is being stretched, right, is what, like, if you're activating the muscle, right? For example, the example we just gave, you are stretching out your quads when you're sitting down in a chair, right? But imagine his hands weren't there. Even though his hands are there, right? His quads are activating. He's utilizing his quads while they're being bent. As he's sitting lower in the chair, it's creating more of a stretch on the quads, but he's still activating them. Therefore, right, that is an eccentric contraction, because usually when we are utilizing a muscle and when we're performing an exercise, we are, like, when we do a bicep curl, this is shortening. My bicep is shortening. This is an eccentric contraction of the biceps. As I'm lowering my hand down, my biceps are getting longer. They're stretching out longer, but they're still contracting. We'll go into why that's important here in a second. So this is an example of a glute ham exercise that is utilizing them in an eccentric way. Number two, right? Another example, lunges, in particular, backward lunges, are eccentrically targeting the quads. Just like sitting down, you're bending your knee. Therefore, this quad muscle attaches here on the other end of the knee. It is stretching out, but it is one of the prime movers and one of the main reasons why you slowly are lowering down, right? And so that's why it's an eccentric contraction. An example of an upper body movement that is eccentrically contracting, right, the muscle, is this overhead tricep extension, right? What he's going to do is he's going to press this weight forward, extending his arms and his elbows, right? But you see here, he's bending his elbows. His elbows are bending. So therefore, as he's lowering it back slowly, he's contracting the quadriceps. Because if he didn't control it back down, right, his arms go whoop, and there'd be no contraction, right? So it's important. That's another reason why it's important to finish up your reps, not just lift up the biceps and let them drop down, not just lift them up and let them drop that back down. You want to do it slow and controlled. That way you get the most, because you're activating your bicep on the way up and you're activating the bicep on the way down. So it's important that you remember that, because that's how you're going to get the most out of your workouts. You don't just want to be all willy-nilly and going at a very fast pace. Last but not least, guys, is the chest press incline or flat, doing what's called negatives. Okay, negatives. That's like the, for lack of a better term, that's the bro terminology. That's the bro science, right? When people are like, you want to go to the gym and hit negatives, that means they're going to eccentrically lower the weight down. And the biggest thing is, you want to find a weight that is almost too heavy for you to lift back up, because you're going to utilize this to build up strength. And we'll go into that here in a minute. But it's very important to understand, the reason why I chose this picture in particular is because this gentleman has a spotter, okay? So unlike like this exercise here, you don't need someone to help pull the weight off, right? You don't need someone to pull the weight off here and here either. You just want to be careful when you do it. Here, if you can't press that weight back up off your chest, you're going to be in for a world of hurting, because the weight is going to be on your chest stuck, and you're going to be the guy in the gym saying, help, help. You're going to say, mom, right? You don't want to be that guy. It's very embarrassing. I've been that guy, right? So as you can see here, his chest is stretching out, right? So he's trying to say, no, don't crush me, don't crush me, don't crush me, don't crush me. And then he contracts and his friend helps him lift it up. As he's going down, he's actively utilizing his chest to lower down slowly. And so that's what's called a negative. And that is the eccentric way to strengthen your chest. There's many, many, many other ones, but I wanted to give you guys some of the most common exercises that you're going to see where you utilize eccentric strengthening. Now, review of rep ranges, right? We went over this in the last one. That's the biggest thing, guys. I know a lot of people, like I had a buddy, one of the guys in the group here, he is pretty much like, yeah, I just pretty much did the workout until I couldn't anymore. Well, that's not necessarily going to be the biggest bang for your buck. When you're trying to gain muscle, it's important that you find a weight that's going to challenge you, and you pretty much, for the most part, for progressive overload, like we went over last week, this is going to be the best. Ooh, didn't mean to move that. This is going to be the best set and rep range for you. Okay, is going to be, ooh, didn't mean to do that. Here we go. And here we go. Sorry about that, guys. Whew. Anyways, so at the end of the day, when you're trying to build muscle, it's important that you lift a heavy weight, right? And typically you want to do that in this rep range here. If you're trying to build muscle, right? 8 to 16 reps. Okay. Now, if you do it slowly, that's gonna help you utilize the eccentric strengthening, right? Strength is gonna be 1 to 6 reps. You can build muscle and you can build size doing this as well, but typically 1 to 6 reps is going to be where you're going to build up strength. And strength and muscle size don't always match up, right? You can see a really strong guy, like you can see someone like me who might be stronger than a guy who looks like The Rock, right? That's not going to be typically, that's kind of an over exaggeration. But the reason being is because The Rock may not be as strong as me, because strength is not only about the muscle size, it's about your neurological patterns. It's about your ability of the body to neurologically say, boom, right? When I bring this weight down on my chest, I might be a better bench presser than The Rock, but he might have bigger muscles than me, right? And that's based off the nervous system. That is based off, muscle size will be play a role in that, but it's not always the exact case. Somebody who's bigger isn't always stronger necessarily. So at the end of the day, you can see some muscle size gain here, but it's more or less going to be in that 8 to 16 rep range, right? And then if we get into the 18 plus range, then we're getting into something different. That is more along the lines of, this is more along the lines of the metabolic conditioning, which we're going to go over next week. All right. So let me see here. There we go. All right. So that's what we're going to be going over next week. Now, eccentric lowering the rep range, you can do any of these rep ranges, because eccentric strengthening is a little bit different than progressive overload. Progressive overload is typically, we're talking about the concentric portion of the movement, right? The opposite. When you're doing a bicep curl and it's shortening, right? We're talking about eccentric, where you're basically contracting as your muscle is stretching out. So here, 1 to 6 reps with a spotter is typically what I recommend if you're going to do eccentric lowering, right? 8 to 16, you can do solo, because you're not going to use such a heavy weight. Now, as we get in here, the most essential piece of the eccentric strengthening is going to be the tempo. How do you do it? How long do you hold? So the tempo refers to the speed or lack thereof that it takes you to perform specific part of the motion. The specific part of the motion is when the muscle is lengthening, right? The bicep curl example is lengthening, right? So the tempo would be like this, right? As I'm lowering the weight down, I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The longer it takes you, the slower tempo that you utilize, the more difficult it's going to be, right? Or the heavier weight, right? So obviously, if you have a really heavy weight, you might not be able to lower it for 5 seconds, because it's going to be really hard to lower it that long period of time, right? If you have a lighter weight, you can lower it down for maybe 5 to 6 seconds, right? So there's that portion as well. So the stretching and everything like that, that's all part of it, but it's going to be anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds is typically where you want to be with an eccentric motion. If you're lowering a weight down for 6 to 10 seconds, I would say 8 to 10 seconds. 6 is okay, right? An extra second over 5 seconds. But if you can lower a weight down for 10 seconds, typically that weight is too light for you, and it's not really going to get you what you want. So typically, if you're going to add eccentric strengthening into your program, which we'll talk about how long you would do that and when you would do that, you want to do it for 3 to 5 seconds. You can do this with all your workouts if you really wanted to, right? Where you went and you lifted a weight up and you explosively lifted it up like bicep curl, boom, right? And then you go 1, 2, 3, boom, 1, 2, 3. You could do that, and that would actually help. But at the end of the day, most people utilize a weight that is really hard for them to get up. So you might see them have bad form. They might try and throw it up and then lower it down slowly. Throw it up and lower it down slowly, right? So that is kind of how that works. Now, the pros of eccentric strengthening, there's a lot actually. And actually, eccentric strengthening is well known as one of the best, if not the best tools to gain strength and to get past plateaus and to build muscle, right? So it has the most strength benefits. Several studies out there have shown that eccentric strength is going to be the best way to go, typically because you can take a weight that is heavier, right, and lower it down slowly, but you might not be able to get it off your chest, right? So your strength is going to be bigger when you lower it down or when you do the eccentric portion, right? You can gain more strength that way, all right? The next reason is it's most functional. Think about it. Most of our exercises, most of the things that we do in our daily life involve eccentric strengthening or eccentric strength, right? It's the best for rehabilitation because it's basically protecting you, right? Because when you rehab, you're doing the reps slow and controlled, creating more stability around the joint. And it's also going to give you the most strength benefits. And strength is typically correlated to having less injuries as well, because muscle size doesn't always correlate over to muscle strength, right? So if someone hits my knee, right, in a bad direction, but my hamstrings are strong enough to take on that, like if someone hits my knee, right, and my knee bends this way typically, but they hit it head on, and my knee goes backwards like this, that would typically cause an ACL tear or some sort of hyperextension injury. But if my hamstrings are strong enough to take on that load, right, and keep my knee joint intact, even though I just took a blunt hit to the knee, that could help you to possibly, avoid injury. So that's another reason. It creates the most muscle damage when you're doing it, right? So that may not sound good, but you pretty much create the most micro tears while you're eccentrically engaging the muscle, right? So you're creating the most muscular tears, which then in turn equal the biggest, the most amount of repair needed, right? Which will equal the most growth, the most muscular growth. So that is why this is probably the most effective way to work out with the eccentric portion, or at least acknowledging the eccentric portion of the workout. So that way your muscle gets torn up more, it repairs more, and it can grow more, right? Also, it requires less reps to do, right? So you really don't even have to do the 8 to 16 rep range, and you can still see a great benefit because you're utilizing more weight and you're contracting for a long period of time, right? The 3 to 5 second lowering or eccentric portion. So that's going to create less wear and tear on your joints because you're not going to need to do this motion as many times. Therefore, it's less repetitions on the joints, right? It's relatively low risk of injury because of the slow and controlled tempo, and it's a great way to break past plateaus. Because what are we trying to do most times, guys? Perform that concentric motion. We're trying to bench press. We're trying to squat, right? We're not thinking about how much weight we can do when we lower the squat. We're not thinking about how much weight we can do when we lower the bench, how much weight we can do when we lower the bicep curl. We're thinking about how much weight we can do when we lift up from the squat, when we press up from the bench, when we lift up the biceps, right? So if you switch it up and you focus on the eccentric lowering of that specific movement, you can see big plateau breaking, okay? Now, the cons, okay, the cons, delayed onset muscle soreness. You've probably heard this before. This kind of exercise creates the most micro tears, the most prevalence of micro tears versus other forms of lifting, right? So what that basically means is your body is going to need to repair that, as I said, and therefore it's going to create the greatest amount of soreness. Now, studies have shown that typically that happens in the beginning. At the beginning of your workout journey, right? If you start to do eccentric lowering, that is going to cause the greatest amount of soreness. The more you do it, the more advanced you are, the less sore you're going to be, okay? So basically, as you progress through your journey, you're going to be less sore from DOMs, right? The other con is that people typically are like, well, I didn't really feel the pump. People go to the gym like, oh, I just love to fill the muscle up with blood and just feel that pump and look big when I get out. You're not necessarily going to feel that from the eccentric lowering because you're not going to be doing those high rep ranges in most cases. Now, if you are, it's going to be a little bit different because you're going to be stretching the muscle out. Therefore, you're not necessarily going to be pumping it up, right? Squeezing that muscle. You're going to actually be stretching that muscle in most cases. Due to high loads required, it can be dangerous. Right? I just said it's not dangerous in the last one, but I said it is dangerous now. And that's for the example of the bench press. When you're lowering the weight down to your chest, it can be dangerous because you're using heavier weight, right? So it's important to have a spotter handy. And the other negative about this is that typically it requires having weight, right? So if you're gonna do that bench press example, you can't really do it unless you have weight, unless you get creative with your workouts, right? So that is the cons section of this. Now, pro tips. Last thing we're gonna get into before we end this, options for scheduling in a program for hypertrophy. So if you're trying to gain muscle, you say, when should I do eccentric? When should I do it? Well, typically, if you hit a plateau and you have not gotten stronger or you haven't seen any changes in your body and, say 3 to 4 weeks, I would add in this, right? I would add in a week of eccentric focused exercises, right? So I would take a break from trying to, press the weight. I would then go into more of an eccentric portion. Just kind of exactly every exercise I explained to you in here would be an example of an eccentric contraction. Or just do the same workouts and focus on the lowering versus the pressing, right? If you're doing the bench press example or the squat example, lower for 3 seconds or 5 seconds versus just dropping down on the squat and then trying to explode up. Drop down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then back up. All right. So that's what I would do. Or what you can do is schedule this in. So what you can do is add in one eccentric focus exercise per day. Or you can add in 1 full week of eccentric focus training. Typically when you do eccentric workouts, you want to use a weight that you can only do 1 more rep of per set. So example, if the set calls for 5 reps, when doing an eccentric strengthening, find a weight you can do for 6 reps, right? That's typically going to challenge you pretty well. Rest is essential and require more rest than simple progressive overload. So with progressive overload, you want to keep your rest time within 45 seconds to 2 minutes. With this, you want to keep your rest time within 2 to 3 minutes between sets, right? Make sure you drink 1+ gallons of water per day to help with soreness, because you will experience more soreness, more likely with this. And then a day after training, you can perform low intensity, steady state cardio to help reduce soreness. So it basically promotes that circulation, moving that lactic acid out of the area and getting that back into circulation so you're less sore, less stiff. Things like walking, biking, elliptical saunas help also. So that's it, guys. Hopefully that all makes sense. I went over a lot today. I'm going to leave this open for questions. Next week, we're going to go over metabolic conditioning. Stay tuned for that. Folks here watching in the portal, I'm going to end the video, and hopefully you guys learned a lot. And if you guys are watching,